Saul Eslake's an independent economist. He's a former board member with Hydro Tasmania. He joins us in the studio this morning. Saul, good morning to you.
Good morning, Leon. Nice to be here.
Are you on Team Hydrogen, Saul?
Well, not at subsidised prices with electricity that we probably don't have at this point. I mean, I've got nothing against hydrogen as an industry, as you said in your intro. It has all sorts of potential uses, so I don't have any problem with having a conversation about the possibility of it being here. But I think any decision as to whether we do welcome an industry like that with open arms ultimately has to be based on whether it stands on its own 2 feet and doesn't rely on expensive subsidies that more than outweigh whatever benefits there might be to Tasmania in terms of long-term employment creation and export income.
What do you mean by subsidies? What do you mean by... is this subsidies in the way we currently effectively subsidise the other major industrials?
Well, there are two different dimensions of that. One is that if we were to sell power to someone like a new hydrogen plant at well below the cost of producing it, that is, in effect, a subsidy. Alternatively, and I've heard, I don't know for sure, that one of the proposals that's been put is that a hydrogen industry in Tasmania would get a deal similar to that's enjoyed by some of the existing major industrial users, but on top of that would get an additional subsidy from either the federal or the state government in order to reduce the effective price of power to something even lower than is enjoyed by the 4 major industrials. Now, remember that when those 4 major industrial companies first came to Tasmania, along with some others who are no longer with us, the deal which they got was based in part on the price of the power, the price of producing the power which they consumed, which was a long time ago when things were a lot cheaper, and the marginal cost of adding new electricity generation capacity to the Tasmanian system, which I think you would have to do in order to meet the requirements that a hydrogen plant would have, that would, on the surface at least, dictate a much higher price for a new entrant than the one that is paid by those industries who've been here for, in some cases, 90, almost 100 years.
So there are questions around the price. When the major industrials go to renegotiate their contracts again, could we argue that there's never been a better time to be producing the sort of electricity that Tasmania currently produces? It is clean and green. It is what the world wants, and it's available in sort of baseload ways. Should all the MIs, the major industrials, Grange, Nearstar, Bell Bay Aluminium, Norska, should they all expect to pay significantly more for their electricity in 2021?
Not necessarily, and there are some complex factors that go into working out what is the appropriate price in these circumstances, and some of that's confidential, and I'm not going to go into it. But among the considerations are what, to put it in layperson's terms, would be a quantity discount. In other words, when you buy a lot more widgets, you expect to pay less per widget than someone only buys a handful of them. The second thing that is part of the pricing consideration is what are called interruptibility provisions. That is, that in certain circumstances when conditions are tight in the electricity market, HydroTas has the right to interrupt the supply to those major users with notice so that everyone else can keep the lights on. And that's like having an extra power station for emergencies, because in effect you can shut down what is a large load for short periods of time and transfer that to other users.
So we saw that when Basslink went down. Some, but not all, of the major industrials took that well, others not so much.
Yeah, that's correct. And as I say, so that's worth something. And that value of, in effect, having a spare power station that can be used in emergencies for short periods of time is something that's valuable to both Hydro Tasmania and to the state, and it's reflected in the price they pay. The other thing is, and obviously the major industrial consumers use this, is that it's one thing to say to a new user, or for a new user to come to Tasmania and say, give us cheap power and we'll create X thousand jobs, you never know whether that promise is going to be kept or not. It's a different thing if an existing one is able to say, look, we employ X thousand people here directly and indirectly. If you don't continue to give us cheap power, we'll leave. That's much easier to see. It's a more potent threat.
Isn't that a great reason why you'd want other new industrials coming into the space? Because then it means you can't get held over a barrel, as Tasmania's hydro and the government have in the past, by industrials threatening to leave. Oh, well, here's a new opportunity down the road. We'll take that. We can get more power for it. We don't need you as much as we did.
Well, that might be a nice position to be in if we had spare power to offer. And one of the issues to be considered here is whether or not Tasmania has the generating capacity to provide an assured supply to another major industrial user, and if we did, whether doing so at the sort of price a major industrial user would expect is the most sensible thing to do by comparison, for example, with exporting an equivalent amount of power over the mainland. So, the talk is, and it's only talk, I don't claim any particular insight, that a major hydrogen plant in Tasmania would want a power price of somewhere between $20 and $40 a megawatt hour. That may include an element of explicit subsidy from the federal or state government rather than buying power gross from hydro at, say, 20 or even 40. But assuming that we had the power available, and that's an important question, is it sensible to do that, even allowing that it might create some jobs, rather than, for example, sell that power at over $100 a megawatt hour over a cable, if the cable is working, or if we get Marinus, up to sell it for over $100 a megawatt hour to mainland consumers, and then that makes lots of money for Hydro Tasmania and TasNetworks, which could in turn be used, in ways to provide better services
hospital
to
schools,
hospital
roads,
schools, or to lower taxes. And the other thing to remember about some of these claims about the amount of jobs involved is that there might well be a lot of jobs in the construction phase. Right? But as I understand it, the number of jobs that might be permanent jobs that might be associated with a hydrogen plant is, of the order of 20. And these things are in some ways like the LNG plants that were built in Queensland and Western Australia. As a caricature, the employment profile of an LNG plant is almost a man and a dog. The man's job being to feed the dog, and the dog's job being to stop the man fiddling with all the expensive equipment that has been built by 3,000 people beforehand. Mm-hmm. That's in some ways...
I literally watched that happen at Wickham Point in
right.
Darwin, in the Northern Territory.
Right.
Enormous confidence in the years that the project was being built, and then literally a collapse for
That's
Darwin.
Right.
Now it was built around a couple of other things, but the end of the Wickham Point gas project was a significant contributor to a whole range of complications that the Territory is still living with.
And then, so there's that question as to whether or not there really are long-term employment gains. And then, there's also the issue of if we don't have sufficient on-island generating capacity to meet another major industrial load like that, but we nonetheless commit to it, well, how do we meet that? Well, the answers are presumably until we get more wind up, which we might in 10 years' time, but we don't at the moment, unless it rains a lot. Or in the 10 years that I was on the hydro board, for example, Tasmania was a net importer over Basslink for all but 2 years. In the 3 years since I've been off the hydro board, Tasmania has been a small net exporter of power over Basslink, but that's because it's been unusually wet, and so the hydro has had more electricity to generate. But if we're not that fortunate, and until 10 more years or so down the track where we have sufficient wind, and even then you have to firm it because the wind doesn't always blow at the times when people want to be making hydrogen or aluminium or zinc or pulp or whatever, then we would either have to run the Tamar Valley power station, which is gas-fired, or import coal-fired electricity from the mainland. What does that do to our aim of being 100% renewable, let alone our target of being 200% renewable?
Saul Eslake is our guest this morning, independent economist and former Hydro board member. Is he on Team Hydro? We're talking about some of the issues that you'd think about from his perspective. Would you be prepared to say no to Andrew Twiggy Forrest if the right deal couldn't be struck then?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we should not be, and let's not kid ourselves that Dr. Forrest, or indeed anybody else who's interested in a proposal like this, is talking exclusively to us that they don't have other alternatives. They will be, as you would expect a big successful corporation to be doing. I mean, Twiggy didn't get to be the second richest guy in Australia with almost $30 billion, according to something I read over the weekend, by being a poor negotiator. He would be in negotiations with other state governments and possibly other locations around the world, seeking to play them off against each other in order to get the best possible deal for himself and his shareholders. So that's the way the capitalist system works, and Tasmania needs to be conscious of that. We do not need to throw ourselves to be participating in a race to the bottom.
And yet it's interesting, that federal government announcement today. Now every state and territory is on the list as potentially receiving part of $150 million. I mean, everybody's into it. It's seen as, I'm sure their marginal electorates will be the focus, but I'm sure every state and territory will be racing at the moment to try and get first mover advantage or some mover advantage in this space. So how Tasmania plays its cards will be interesting to watch. Saul Eslake, our guest this morning. So while we've got you here this morning, we want to range across a few other topics. Sure. Border reopenings. You're an economist. How do you see the issue? You understand the health system in Tasmania. You understand the various sectors that will benefit from and suffer from if COVID gets out here, but border restrictions are relaxed. How do you see it?
Well, there are sort of two things that strike me, Leon. One is that closure of state borders is something that very few countries with states or provinces have done in the way that Australia's done it. Indeed, even when it comes to international borders, as far as I know, no other democratically governed country has been as tough on movements of its citizens across its borders as Australia has been. No democracy has prevented its citizens from leaving in the way that ours has, and it's not obvious how stopping Australians leave helps to spread the virus. To stem the spread of the virus, what it does do is reduce the demand for quarantine for people who come back and allow the federal government to get away without doing much about something that the Constitution says is a federal responsibility. No other democracy that I'm aware of has banned its citizens from returning, let alone threatening them with jail, as Australia did at one stage for people who found themselves stuck in a country where they were highly likely to get the disease and potentially die of it, as I think 3 Australians did in India. No other democracy has done that to its citizens. But as far as I know, no other federation has stopped its people travelling across state or provincial borders. I mean, imagine if New York and New Jersey had closed their borders to each other and stationed armed police and soldiers on the George Washington and Tappan Zee bridges, or in the Lincoln and Holland tunnels, turning back cars with the wrong licence plates, or if Virginia and Maryland had built a ring of steel around Washington, D.C. to stop people commuting from their work in the nation's capital. Yet we've done that. We can, I suppose, in part because, with the exception of the Gold Coast and Albury-Wodonga, hardly anyone lives along Australia's borders. But again, with the exception of Ottawa and Hull, no one lives on Canadian provincial borders. But Canadian provinces, as far as I know, haven't done this. So
maybe that's because there's been an equality in the level of COVID that they've been dealing with. So there's a sense of perhaps equilibrium. How does Tasmania handle the issue? So we had Catherine Morgan-Wicks in the studio. Started last week, 90% plus she wants as a vaccination rate before we start to emerge from
and I think from a health perspective, that's probably the right view to take. I mean, despite what I've said about how unusual our border closures are in an international context, I wouldn't dispute the argument that I don't doubt the government of Tasmania, like its counterparts in WA and Queensland and South Australia, would say that that's helped, in their phrase, keep Tasmanians safe. And we haven't seen the number of infections and cases and deaths that have been seen in Victoria last year and again this year, and even more so in New South Wales in recent months. I do worry about the thresholds for vaccinations that have been set in the so-called national plan, because governments insist in couching those in terms of what they call the eligible they don't usually say that. They talk about 70% of the population being vaccinated, or 80%. What they actually mean is of the so-called eligible population, which is still people over 16, even though now 12 to 15-year-olds are eligible to get the virus, but 20% of Australia's population is under 16. So when you talk about 70% of the eligible population being vaccinated, what you actually mean is 56% of the total population, and that's relevant because we know that kids can get and transmit the virus and can get very sick from it, so we ought to be concerned about their safety as well, I would have thought. 80% of the eligible population is 64% of the total population. All of the epidemiological modelling that I have seen, and I've tried to look at it, and the experience of countries like the UK and Israel tells us that opening up with 64% of the total population vaccinated, which is what 80% of the eligible means, that's risky and dangerous. And that's why, Dan Andrews, the Premier of Victoria, is now warning his people that when they start to open up, they can have 4,000 cases, and did he say 2,000 deaths? I don't think I'm verbaling him in saying that. So, I suspect what we're going to see, given that New South Wales and Victoria, whose populations are sick of lockdowns, you can understand that, they are going to open up. They are going to have a lot of cases. The outlying states, which includes Tasmania, where the people haven't had much experience of lockdowns, but they haven't also had much experience of COVID and very few deaths. They're probably going to go their own way, and we are going to have two Australias, I suspect.
I wonder if there's a consequence of that, though. We're saying invite Tasmania to open up and start relaxing restrictions, even if we get to 90%. But then what will the reaction be when COVID arrives? Is that going to mean that gyms close? Is it going to mean that restrictions are severely limited if it happens before Christmas? Will it mean, hey, Saul, only 4 people over at your place for Christmas lunch because we need to control the potential spread of COVID because of the hospital system? I wonder if that's a price worth paying and how that discussion is.
If the Tasmanian authorities are saying they want 90% of the population, if Ms Morgan Wicks means the eligible population, then that's 72%, or actually in Tasmania it'd be a bit more, of the eligible, of the total population, then that is safer. And, I wouldn't criticise the government for wanting to hold off there. I think, though, and the Premier has made this point in terms of introducing this requirement to wear masks at gatherings of more than 1,000, is that if we do open our borders, then there is going to be a greater risk of COVID being imported from states where it's circulating, most obviously Victoria, since that's closer to us, and we will have to take additional precautions. So hopefully we won't go back to some of the sillier things like the ban on so-called vertical drinking, but there may well be more restrictions on how many people can gather in certain conditions, and we might have to wear more masks. We might have to wear masks in more places, and that's a trade-off between being confined to this island, as most of us have been for. Well, how long has it been? 3 months now,
coming
or something
up to,
like that.
And close on
and even before then, when you came and go, you in effect had to apply for a visa in order to get into the country and into the state, and line up for between half an hour and an hour in the cold, which other states didn't make due to their incoming arrivals with their visa requirements. So hopefully we're going to move on from those sorts of things as well.
On Mornings Around Tasmania, Saul Eslake's our guest this morning, 29 to 10. Sarah Jane Bell's in the newsroom with headlines. Saul, a final question for you. Reading an article, I think I'll credit the News Limited press on the weekend. Are you concerned at all that the China housing collapse, that huge company over
Evergrande,
there, Evergrande, are you concerned that there might be some contagion in the Australian housing market, which is super hot at the moment, as you well know? Concerned that there might be some contagion spread from Evergrande to our shores?
No. Evergrande's a big thing in China. It has debts of $300 billion. It is the billion US. It's the biggest property development company in China. Its founder and chair is very well connected. He was at the 1st of July celebration for the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. I suspect there will be a bailout in order to contain the implications for the Chinese financial system. But here in Australia, where, as you say, property prices are at, in some cases, including in Tasmania, levels that are hard to justify by reference to any rational criteria, the fact that there might be something like that happening in China, I don't think has any direct implications for property prices or the banking system here in Australia. We're not connected to the Chinese banking system in the way that the whole world was connected to the US and European financial systems 15 years ago at the time of the global financial crisis. It's a potentially big problem for China, but China has the resources and the administrative capacity to deal with it, and I would expect that they will.
Saul, great to see you this morning. Thanks for coming in.
That's a pleasure.
Saul Eslake, independent economist, former Hydro board member.